Good evening, everybody. Please sit down. Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. We have a very, very special guest tonight that I'm both personally and on behalf of Harvard and the Kennedy School professionally pleased to welcome here. And that is Senator Bob Corker. Let me tell you a little something about him. I've had the pleasure, and this rarely does one say this as a cabinet member testifying in front of a committee chairman, but I had the pleasure of testifying in front of him. And I say pleasure because he was always very incisive, of course, but civil and courteous at all times, and ran a decorous hearing that you could really sink your teeth into. He's had an extraordinary career, and that's the reason why I asked him to come here, and to come here at this time of year as a lot of students are thinking about what they do next. You know him and think of him as a senior United States Senator, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and also a member of the Banking and Finance Committees and budget committees of the Senate. And let's just pause on that for a moment, and then I'm going to tell you the thing that's really special about him, and I think going to be especially intriguing and useful to our students here. Let me go back in time a little bit and remind you who in the last 100 years of American history has been chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Just listen to these names, and then add Corker to the end. Henry Cabot Lodge. Arthur, I'm not being exhaustive here, but this isn't a total, I'm not being very selective here either. Arthur Vandenberg, J. William Fulbright, Frank Church, Richard Lugar. By the way, Dick passed away yesterday, and those of us who knew him and appreciated him for many years are sad to see another giant go. Claiborne Pell, Jesse Helms, Joe Biden, John Kerry, Bob Corker. That's a pretty good company to be in. He's done a lot more than that, though. He, in addition to being a senior legislator, has been an executive as mayor of Chattanooga. I think something you once told me was your favorite job of all. And those are two completely different kinds of roles. And before that, a very successful businessman for a long time. Started his own business at a young age, a construction company, and ended up running that after it grew into a multi-state venture. Then a real estate holding company added to that, so very successful in business, in government at the municipal level, executive government, and of course legislative at the very highest level, all the way from 2007 to 2019, and he elected a couple of years ago not to stand for re-election, but instead spend his time other ways, which he may choose to talk to you about this evening. The reason I wanted him to come here is twofold. First of all, the arc of that life is something a lot of you at this time of year are beginning to wonder what your own will look like. And so you may want to ask him how he thought at each of those stages about what was next. These are the kind of questions students ask me all the time. How do I figure out where to go? What did it feel like when you were in my shoes? Here you have an opportunity to ask a giant those kinds of questions. The other thing that makes him really kind of refreshing in this time is the civility and dedication to substance that characterized him as a senator and has characterized him ever since he left. And I'm just going to read one quote, which caught my eye and I think is a wonderful one. To me, he said, the people in Washington that have courage are the people who stay out of the right or left ditch and are willing to reach across the aisle and to solve our nation's problems. And in doing so, know that they're burning up capital as they do that. That's a pretty arresting quote. So Bob, let me first of all thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you all for coming here this evening. And let's start off on that. You had this varied career, successful in all of the major domains. How did you do it? How did you see each phase? And what's your advice to these people as they find their way?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for your great service to our nation. It's great to be back at Harvard. I was here in my 30s as I felt I had a company that was growing at 80% a year, and I came to an OPM program here, owner president. I think it's really more of a profit center for Harvard, but I was here with about 110 business people from around the world and saw what a great experience, just a slice of it that each of you are having, and what a privilege it is to come to higher education establishment like this. Then I was here after being elected mayor at the Kennedy School and was able to be with other mayors here, and it was very helpful as I was just coming into office. So it's great to be back. It's kind of daunting to be speaking to folks that I know have a much greater formal education than me, and certainly a higher intelligence quotient, but I'll do the best I can. So when I got out of the University of Tennessee, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, and that was to go in the construction business. And what I find for young people is that's the most important thing, is knowing what you want to do. Many of my friends kind of goofed around for 8 or 10 years as they tried to figure out what they were going to do. But all of your parents and friends and loved ones want you to launch well, to move to the next steps as quickly and as purposely as you can. So anyway, I learned how to build a building, Ash, for about 4 years. I was a construction superintendent out on job sites. I learned how to build big regional malls. I went in business with $8,000 that I had saved in bonuses and built a company that somehow or another, for the first 9 years it was in business, grew at 80% a year, operated in 18 states. And along the way, in my late 20s, I realized that I was going to be financially well off. I knew that I knew how to do business, and if I just paid attention, I was going to be independent. I began looking at the needs of our community. I actually went on a mission trip to Haiti, which had a huge effect on me. I began working in the inner city. I saw that we had a lot of people in Chattanooga that didn't have decent housing, and so I led the creation of a nonprofit as a civic endeavor. They ended up helping about 10,000 families have decent, fit, and affordable housing. A Democratic governor, I think you know I'm a Republican, saw what I was doing there. He asked me to serve on a board in Nashville. He was newly elected, and I began to see how public policy affected people's lives. I was asked to be Commissioner of Finance for the state of Tennessee for a new governor coming in, who really was more politically focused, not operationally focused. In our state, you ran the state. I did that for about a year and a half, and it was an incredible experience to be able, with the flick of a pen, to do things that would affect people all across our state. It was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. I borrowed a lot of money and bought 2 companies when I left there, people back in Chattanooga. People asked me to run for mayor. Most folks thought I would run for governor at that time. I ran for mayor. I don't know why. But I got to tell you, it was the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life. And let me just say, I say to young students, as I will this weekend in graduation, that number 1, master something, become independent. Number 2, do what you do with boldness. The things you attempt to do with boldness. And 3, give back. I will say that, Ash, there's no question that the 4 years serving as mayor of a city where you can create a vision, put the pieces in place and make it happen and really transform a city and affect people's lives so directly, probably the most rewarding experience of my life. Bill Frist and Lamar Alexander. Bill Frist also served his 2 terms. He was the majority leader of the Senate when he stepped down. He came and recruited me heavily, even took me up into the mountains once with no electricity and you know, his security detail, and you know, but anyway, I ended up running for the Senate. It was a nationalized race. I was the only newly elected Republican coming in the Senate that year. There were 9 Democrats who also came in. And I, for 6 weeks, I wondered, why did I do this? Why did I spend 2 years running? 26, 27 meetings a day, sort of senseless. I called time out with our staff, began to focus on the big issues, feeling that if I mastered a few of the big issues, at some point in time I'd have an outsized role in the Senate. I camped on the Foreign Relations Committee, got a call one night during the financial crisis to meet the next morning with Bernanke and Paulson, and played an outsized role there early on. I just say that due to circumstance, it happened. But being the 12 years in the Senate was heady. I traveled extensively, as you did. As you know, just like in business, you spend 80% of your time on problems, 20% of your time on opportunities. So I was in 79 countries on your behalf, and many of them over and over again because there were so many problems there. I will say that being in the Senate was the greatest privilege of my life. I didn't find it near as... it didn't have that same feeling as being an executive and creating a vision for a city, but also being so close and being able to touch people and see the impact that it was having on their life. So I feel like I'm the most blessed person in the world. I can't imagine when I started and left University of Tennessee at 21 or 22 that I would have even imagined doing these things. I did not come from a family that ever thought about being in the political arena, quote, quote. But my life has been enriched. More importantly, I hope that I've been able to do some things along the way that have greatly benefited others, and I think that I have.
Well, you certainly have. We'll come to some of them in a minute. But was it the fact that you'd been doing it for a number of years and wasn't the best job you'd ever had, but it was kind of fun? Is that what made you decide that you're just going to go off and do something else now and leave the Senate? Senate's position of seniority is, on the one hand, a hard thing to leave, but you're telling these folks out here it's also important to feel good about what you're doing.
Yeah. So first of all, I think public service is absolutely an honorable thing to do, and would encourage everyone in this audience and those listening in to consider doing it at some juncture in life. I woke up one day, Ash, and thought I'd always been a business guy. And I did the math and realized in the last 25 years, as of the day I left, 20 and a half of those I had spent running for public office or serving. But the real reason was this. When I ran back in 2006, Bill Frist had just stepped down after 12 years. And in our DNA in that time, it was just that you would serve 2 terms and leave. I mean, that's what I talked about on the campaign trail, is that I would, and by the way, my opponent, Harold Ford, said the same thing during the campaign. We both said to the people of Tennessee that we're going to serve 2 terms. Then what happens, you're right, you're chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. On our side of the aisle, you've got term limits. So I had 2 more years left if I had run again and won. But then I was chairman of the banking committee immediately. So I had a big run in front of me, and the leadership of the Senate, others, the executive branch, people, and Kurt back home. At the end of the day, Ash, I think I may serve again in the public arena. I don't know what that might be. I truly don't as we sit here. But I think my patience, just each of us has we each have different temperaments and talents. And I really think that I was fortunate that my patience with legislation in 12 years happened to cross almost exactly at the same time. I'm much more of an executive. Great privilege to have done what I did. Hopefully had impacts in that way, but the bigger issue was just what I had told voters back home.
So let me ask you about the mood in the Senate, and I'll ask you sort of a homeland question, and then we'll go across will go overseas. But here at home, I've read a number of things you said about just the climate of Washington. I thought it was very eloquent about the right-hand ditch and the left-hand ditch, and it taking courage and knowing that you're burning your political capital. What's your view in general in Washington now? And then I'll take you to the Democratic side, the Republican side.
Sure. Well, thanks. First of all, I have not seen 1 second of cable television since I left on January 3rd. It used to be that we had it tuned on, and in our communications office, all the various channels were on. And when we walked down the hallway to a committee hearing or whatever, or to a vote, we knew we were going to be asked the most current issue that had come up. I get up, I still read numbers of publications in the morning, but I feel like, if 24 hours goes by and I don't know until the next morning what happened, life is still okay. So I don't, I will say the cable, and they were my friends, and Ash, as you know, especially since 2016, the halls are full of cameras now.
Yeah.
It never was like that until 2016. You had print reporters, but you didn't have TV networks and cable out in front of your office waiting on you after every meeting or every time you came back to the office. So I haven't had the same digestion of news that some of the people in the room may have had, but I'll just tell you, generally speaking, things get distorted. These things you watch on television is a pretty major distortion. I look around the room, y'all are kind of quiet today. If this was a room of senators, Democrat and Republican, you wouldn't know who was who sitting. Everybody's very collegial. When you go down to the Senate, and by the way, senators usually don't listen to anybody else, so they be talking to each other while we're talking. I'm kidding, didn't go over so well, I guess, but that's typically the way things are. If you go down to the Senate floor, there'd be senators trying to do deals with each other because, the Senate takes 60 votes to pass cloture, and so for anything to pass, you've got to have a co-sponsor. So if you went down to vote, you'd see people that are very diverse talking with each other about pieces of legislation. The issues seem to divide. I'll give you one little vignette. I was down at the Belfer Center. Howard Baker, to me, was, one of my great heroes, if you will, and all of us who've come after him have tried to take on, many of his characteristics. But when I was first in the Senate, there would be votes where I'd have to go out to that back balcony. I don't know if you've ever been back there. You may not have.
I've seen
There's a place back behind the Senate, back behind where senators kind of are quiet and read sometimes. And I'd have to go back there and make a decision, and not to be too, whatever you might call it here, meditate, do whatever you wish to the scales of justice. Is our country going to be slightly better off with this or slightly worse off with this vote? Very few votes like that anymore. Things are sort of pre-cooked now. The issues, which ones are going to pass overwhelmingly, which are nothing burgers, and which ones, are going to be straight partisan lines. So the debate is not the same just because the issues, the parties, the two sides are so far apart from each other. But listen, the collegiality. I know a senator who's just there. He's a very famous person who just arrived in the Senate. Called a friend of mine in Tennessee this last week who they're trying to talk into running for Lamar's seat, who's stepping down, to share with him. He said, I'm stunned by how collegial everyone is on both sides of the aisle. So again, it's not near what people think as it relates to how people relate to each other.
Well, there have always been, for much of our recent history, there have been two parties. And why are things so partisan now? What is it that revs it up and makes it so zero-sum as it appears on the outside? Recognizing that as human beings, people deal with one another. From the outside looking in, it seems zero-sum.
So while there's a swath of people in the middle that just would like to see common sense prevail and would like to see us solve the issues that we have to deal with, You know, the primaries, Ash, as you know, are not driven by that group of people. They're driven by people more on the extremes. And I know this takes a little bit of looking in the mirror. Believe it or not, Washington more closely reflects the American people than they would like to wish. And so we have these extremes that are driving the primaries. And that over time, you know, the abuse of the cloture vote, I mean, the filibuster is just absolutely abused, never intended to be used this way. And both sides of the aisle have decided, hey, whatever it takes to block a piece of legislation we may be against, we're going to use all of those tools, which is what has caused the Senate to just drop in stature. By the way, not senators, but just the way the Senate itself drops. As a matter of fact, I'd say we've got as much talent in the Senate and hardworking people as we've ever had. But it just is different in that regard. And then you have, you know, the George Bush ran to be a unifying president. He was a compassionate conservative. And then all of a sudden 9/11 occurs. You have the two wars, which ended up dividing the country. Then you had, I think, something that was a solar plexus blow to him was what happened down in Louisiana, Katrina. And then when he was accused of being a racist, if you will, I just think it took a lot out of him. But anyway, the country was, then Obama ran. When he was elected in 2008, he ran against John McCain. Lizzie and I were sitting at home and we said, you know, look, he ran on a message of unity, hope. Who knows? This could work out. And then all of us, then he became a divisive president. Was it of his own making? I don't know. And then now we have a president who purposely divides, right? I mean, that's his governing model, is to try to consolidate everything he can. So now you have two presidents before him who I think wanted to be unifying figures. We actually have a president today who purposely, as a governing model, is dividing.
I'm going to come back to him, and I'm sure people in the audience will as well. But let's stick with the Democrats here for one moment. They got a lot of different candidates running this year. What does being a Democrat at the national level mean anymore, from the point of view of somebody who's pretty seasoned and granted a Republican? And I'm going to ask you the same thing. What is being Republican? My parents were respectively a Democrat and Republican in Philadelphia, and I used to think I knew, and they used to think they knew what parties stood for. I think if I brought them back now, they wouldn't recognize anymore. Let's start with the Democrats.
So I thought Peggy Noonan about 3 weeks ago had a great, she does an opinion piece. It usually is printed on Saturday. Mm-hmm. And I thought that she was good, not talking necessarily about the presidential candidates, but laying out the fact that what you're seeing on the Democrat side, and especially some of the new freshmen that are coming in, that they are the offspring of President Trump. In other words, that the way he has conducted himself has caused this sort of massive directional shift in just behavior, if you will, by some of these young people coming in. And of course, what that does with these presidential candidates on the Democratic side is put pressure. Again, I go back to the primary, I go back to the fact that going out and running as someone who's going to reach across the aisle and solve problems, that doesn't get the base too revved up right now. Okay, it does the people in the middle, but you know, people are out there being very strident. I know most of them very well. I might add that there's only been 2 senators elected to president since 1960, so we're all focused on the ones we know. Could well be that a senator gets elected president this year, but you know, it hasn't been the way it's been most of the time since 1960. But each of them are trying to do what they can, Ash, to capture the imagination, the energy. The energy in the base right now on the Democratic side is obviously with the more extreme positions, which I think creates a big challenge for your and my friend Joe Biden. When I came to the United States Senate, he was chairman of our committee. This may hurt him. And by the way, I'm I'm not showing affection in this direction, meaning I'm supporting, I'm just observing. He's a well-liked person on both sides of the aisle. He's been more modest in his proposals. He's mostly tried to unify people, and it'll be really interesting. I said this Friday night at a talk in Chattanooga. It'll be really interesting to see if he can both capture some of the energy on the left, and at the same time, again, for the people who may be center-left and maybe even center, and maybe some people center-right based on what's happening right now, can he also continue to espouse economic growth, which has lifted millions of people out of poverty all around the world, and certainly in our own country. So it's going to be an interesting, but what's caused everything to move to more extreme positions. I asked a candidate, this is a little vignette, after the 2016 race, there was one particular candidate that had really espoused Medicare for all. And you might guess who that is. And somebody I happen to like a great deal personally. I find this person to be very authentic, and I came in with this person to the Senate. But I asked this person after the race was over, I said, this Medicare for all thing is, I'd love to see everybody in our country have health care. I really would. I really would like to see everybody. I said, did y'all ever run the numbers on Medicare for all? Because my staff has run the numbers, and it's semi-problematic. It's way problematic, numbers-wise. And the person said, no, we didn't. So I think, I hope that as these proposals come out this year, that there'll be a real debate on the Democratic side as to how you actually implement those things. And I think that to the extent, this will be my observation, I know the energy is with the far left, but to the extent, left type candidate gets elected, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Democratic Party to win the presidency.
All right, let's go to the Republican side.
Okay.
And again, it was my father who was the Republican.
Well, why don't you say, in my Republican Party, too?
And your Republican Party, too? Yeah, no, I'm sorry. No, of course. But that's really where I'm going, is what do these things mean anymore?
Yeah.
Now you have someone who my father would not recognize as the leader of the party.
Right.
But commands a substantial voting block.
Right.
And that's on the Republican side, sort of the mirror of what you were describing and without kind of getting back to where it came from. All the Republicans that I worked with over 30 years and so forth, they haven't found a place in this administration.
Yeah.
And so it's odd, because to me the Republican sort of establishment is on the outside now.
Yeah.
And what's your sense of where that's going in the future? And you said something very intriguing a couple of weeks ago that might have been misreported, but you said that you didn't rule out President Trump having a challenger for the Republican nomination. That's an intriguing thing. So if you could touch on that also.
Yeah. So let's face it, where we are today in our country, and it's on both sides of the aisle, is this, we're in this populist fever, right? It's happening throughout Europe, happened in Brazil in the most recent election. So it's something that has taken hold, and let's realize that a lot of people that are educated in our country and so many other places, their wages have continued mostly to improve pretty substantially. People who do not have a four-year college degree have not. They've done very poorly, and that's Republicans and Democrats, have had the same issues. If you haven't gone to college, if you've been working in a manufacturing job or doing something else, in all likelihood, you haven't your weight. So there's a distress that's out there, a distress amongst people, and that's what's taking both sides of the aisle to the way they are. President Trump, as to whether he was even seeking to actually win, you hear the reports he was doing it just to improve his image, business-wise. Who knows? But the fact is, he went to these rallies. Remember, he used to throw things out and just sort of make it up as he went along. And if he got a cheer, that was his policy. If he got didn't get much out of it, he moved on to something else. And so somehow or another, he tapped into it. But let me go back. Look, I'm a Republican because I believe that America is a force for good in the world, and that our role in the world, if we continue to be the leader of the world, that doesn't mean we have to send troops everywhere, morally and in every other way, that's good for our own citizens. It makes them more safe. Well, that's a different place than where this president is. Usually Republicans have been kind of slow to the table. We're the other side of the aisle, quote, to use, has been a little bit more progressive. We're more traditionalist, and therefore we respect the institutions of government. We know they need to have oversight, and they make mistakes. You need to be vigilant to keep a democracy healthy and whole, but to purposely undermine the institutions of government for your own strengthening of your political standing is just foreign to me, and I think foreign to most of these people you're referring to, but it's a way of daily activity right now, right? The fiscal issues, those have been important, and if you look at the 2016 race, neither Secretary Clinton nor President Trump ever mentioned mandatory spending, which is where all of the money is. All of the money, amazing. Okay? The discretionary spending, what we vote on each year, all of y'all know, is about 33% of what we spend. Everything else is on autopilot. There have to be adjustments made for our nation to be strong, and yet no one wants to talk about it. And yet, even amongst the Republican base now, and if you think about where the Republican base is, I'm 66 years old. You're somewhere in that time frame. You're not on our side of the aisle, I know, but we're now made up of older white people more so than we have been in the past. And I don't know, is there any appetite to deal with the real drivers of spending? I don't see it. And so the notion about a primary would be to have there won't be a debate, I don't think, about real fiscal issues if we have President Trump as the nominee and certainly someone on the left. It's just not going to happen, okay? If you remember, Secretary Clinton was actually doubling down on adding entitlements. Mm-hmm. Again, I understand she was trying to get elected. We're in this populist mode, but there's going to be no real debate on that. None, in all likelihood. Is there going to be any real debate other than sort of a low level on immigration reform? I remember President Bush put forth, President Bush wanted to solve the immigration issue. President Obama, I actually, I co-authored an amendment in immigration on 2013, which caused the immigration bill to pass the Senate with 68 votes. The House didn't take it up, unfortunately. Needed to be improved, but it could have gone over. And we have a president right now that, let's face it, he could have had $25 billion 10 months ago for border security by just making a deal to make it so that dreamers could stay here in our country and have jobs and go to school, which 85% of Republicans agree with. But there's no desire I don't think there's a desire to solve that problem before the election even. And so it's going to be one of border security versus asylum. It's not going to be a real debate on solving the problem. So that's why I think a Republican primary might be useful for people who've been Republicans that might want to talk about fiscal issues, might want to talk about foreign policy in its traditional way, might want to talk about the institutions of government, might want to talk about some of these other issues like transportation, actually paying for it as we go, those kinds of things. But otherwise, I think it's going to be, could end up being an extremely low-level race where there's no real discussion about solving problems, more of a discussion about look how bad they are, look how bad they are.
You want to say who might?
I don't
be
know.
in that
I don't
camp?
know at this juncture. I don't know. I mean, I don't see today. And let me say the other thing. Most people who are of the substance to be able to go out and do that, I think want to ensure that they're not on just a Don Quixote, kind of exhibition here where there's no chance whatsoever of winning. But look, it's a long time before you have to actually register to run in New Hampshire. These things happen quickly. Name awareness with all the news outlets that are out there today is not an issue, but we'll see. It doesn't seem to be shaping up today, but it could.
Okay. Let's go around. Let's touch on a few parts of the world now, which you know very well. Let's start with China. We have trade talks going. You talked about American values in the world, which I appreciate all that you did to represent that when you were a senator, and I share that belief. And I don't mean to be accusatory towards China overall, but it is a communist dictatorship, and we are not. And so how do you have a reasonable relationship with a country that is like the Soviet Union was, except that we never traded with the Soviet Union? Yeah,
now they're different. They have, they may be a communist in name country. They very much have embraced the market, right? And meaning competing with us and competing with other countries. They do something internally different inside. What I would add to your description, Ash, is that when you meet with leaders of China, which you have done many, many times, more than me, actually, they not only are what they are, this one-party system, but they believe that their model is the superior model. Mm-hmm. And they're watching us. We have a 37-day totally made up fight that shuts down government. You can't even fund government for 37 days. They look at where we are fiscally, they look at our decision-making process, and they absolutely, with every cell in their body, believe their model is superior to ours. And that at some point in time, they're going to surpass us in every way. Look, I thought the tariffs that the president and the administration put in place against Mexico and Canada and against our friends in the European Union were totally ridiculous, okay? I mean, just totally ridiculous. Steel and aluminum tariffs under the National Security Clause of the 1974 Trade Act. I thought it was an abuse. I use abuse of authority. I'd actually like to use another word, but it's an abuse of authority. Couldn't get, I tried to pass a bill to stop it and take that power back. Couldn't do it. But I will say what they're doing with China, I don't know the tariff piece, let's just say is out there. I think they really are. It appears to me they're trying to do the tough work on China. It appears to me that they're trying to negotiate a deal that keeps them from forcibly stealing our intellectual property, or companies are forced to transfer, and to move away from us having to have a U.S. company having to have a partner in China. So it actually appears to me that maybe they're moving in the right direction. And of course, we'll see in the next 2 or 3 weeks when this comes to an end what it actually means. As opposed to the NAFTA deal, which appears to me to be just the president's characteristics are that anything anyone else did before him wasn't good, and anything he did. So the NAFTA thing to me appears to be sort of not much. it appears to be sort of anti-trade, creating friction. I could go in, you haven't asked me about it, so I won't go into details there, but this thing with China, it appears to me that they're approaching it in the right way as it relates to trade.
So
and we'll see in a couple
let me pull
weeks.
that thread a little bit, because
Okay.
the right way, I want to get back to the values.
Okay.
Because it does seem to me that the administration is sticking up for principles of trade that are not the Xi Jinping way. The Xi Jinping way, the system that is successful in their eyes, is one where military, economic, and political power can all be brought to bear on trade partners, and they're made to heal. It's not the trade system that we have championed, that has worked for us, of course, and is comported with our own principles, but we have argued at least worked for the whole world as well. And so it is, in that sense, one view versus another view, and that's something that they're able to do because of the nature of their system. And I don't want to say I'm not out to get China, but you have to recognize, since you brought up the question of values and competing systems, what are we for as a country? And isn't that also something that it seems to me when we stand up to them in trade things, we're standing up for those things as well, which is the reason why it's not about me, but I welcome this as well. This is one part where I think it's long overdue to take on the Chinese about
I couldn't agree more,
trade.
and I couldn't agree more. And hopefully, we're going to end up with an end product here. I think when China came into the WTO in 2000 or whenever it was, people expected them to evolve. They have not done so in the way that people expect. They are taking advantage, and I think that's one area where it appears that we're taking the right steps as it relates to trade anyway.
Can I do one more with you before we go to questions? You, at one point, suggested, I forget what your turn of phrase was, that Americans don't want us to be at war all the time either, and I understand that. And in that connection, because you know so much about them and you did so much work with respect to all three, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. You want to take us around that run for a moment, and are we headed in the right direction? Would you, as you take them one by one, stay, I realize that's a very elastic thing, but more or less stick with some version of a mission there? Or do you think it's been accomplished or not worth it any longer? What's your advice in those three areas?
So I'm going to do it quickly because I can see we've got about 15 minutes left. I know you want to have questions. Afghanistan was the good war, if you remember. It happened after 9/11. At least that's the way people in the media and other places want to describe it. And it's turned out to be incredibly difficult. As you know, in the 07-08 time frame, well, let me put it this way. I was on the ground a lot during that time, and there's no question that resources that would have been going to Afghanistan at that period of time were going to Iraq.
Yep.
And so what you had was a lot of lost focus, energy, and time. And it's interesting, we're going to end up, let's face it, the very people that we routed out of office were negotiating. We're hoping we're going to end up making an arrangement to bring them back into the government. So it's, I don't know how to describe it except that it hasn't been particularly successful. Women are voting. Women are going to school. There are a lot of really good American values that certainly have happened, but the cost has been incredible. Pakistan has been incredibly duplicitous in dealing with this all the way through. On one hand, taking money from us, on the other hand, undermining what was happening there. Iraq, interestingly, which was the bad war, people thought that we went there under the wrong pretenses. It actually appears that they are semi-functional. Again, we're talking trillions of dollars of treasure. More importantly, many men and women who lost their lives and limbs. Ash, that one's going to take a long time for history to judge. But it's actually in a much better place today, isn't it? It's interesting. Of course, the whole balance of power changed. Here we had Saddam Hussein was a great balance against Iran, and now we're relying upon Saudi Arabia and UAE. I'll leave that chapter unwritten or undiscussed. But the balance of power issue is ended up changing dramatically. Syria, look, I think there was a point in time when we could have done far more than we did. And we created a vacuum by not doing so, and yet had really strong rhetoric. We were encouraging these people to protest. We weren't encouraging them to take up arms, but we were really encouraging them. And it's been that to me was the most, when the red line was crossed, I'm sorry, when the red line was crossed and we did nothing, I know that people think I'm just on the other side of the aisle. I actually worked very, very closely with the Obama administration. It was a solar plexus blow to our country's standing, but it also created a vacuum that Putin has stepped in, and now he's on the world stage in a place that he's punching way above his weight. Everyone here knows their economy is the size of Italy. Not many of us.
Down.
For any Italians, I'm sorry, no disrespect, but we don't pay a lot of attention to them. And so he's done a lot militarily to put himself in this place, no question. But Syria has been it's the saddest of all the stories. Half the people displaced. He's going to be back in power fully soon. I don't know what else to say. Well, it says, I think, you as a military leader, far more shrewd and knowledgeable than me, that in all of these things, one needs to start knowing what the end game is. In two occasions, I'm not sure we fully thought that through. And then on the third one, because of that, we didn't take some of the steps we should have taken.
We have some questions now, and this is a student of mine, and there are actually a few students of mine coming.
Yes, thank you, Professor
From
Carter.
Ukraine.
Thank you, my favorite professor, for bringing Mr. My name is
You're her
Miroslava.
favorite senator, too. I mean, there's a lot of
My name is Miroslava Gongadze. I'm a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard. I would like to ask you about American politics. As they say, it's impossible to unscramble scrambled eggs, and you talk about this polarized politics now, and those senators who are working over the aisles are dying out.
Question. You're a journalist.
Question is, what is your recipe to fix these things, and how much leadership we need to possibly fix these things? Maybe you or Mr. Biden or whatever. Who can do it?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to see you. I happened to see her walking in, so I knew where to come. Thank you so much. And we've interviewed each other before. A legislative body, people say, well, the Senate needs to do this, and there ought to be 10 folks in the middle that would do this, or the House needs to do that. Of course, as y'all all know, the House is strictly an operation that operates by majority rule. The only thing that is going to cause the kind of thing that you'd like to see happen and other citizens around our country is you've got to have a president who truly wishes to solve our nation's problems and understands that the only way to do that is to unify people around those solutions. And until that happens, we're going to continue like we are. So it's got to be, and people, the people of our country, this great nation, the greatest on earth, which has the greatest citizens. I mean, where I'm out now, I'm not hanging around the Senate chambers, who, by the way, many great senators, great House members, a lot of good, hardworking people. the people that I see today are people at the Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs and boys clubs, and our nation is made of wonderful people who care about others, who want to give of themselves. And I think that currently, today, 2 years, we've had a situation where we haven't wished to speak to the better angels of the American people. We just have not. And so, our people have got to want solutions, which will, by the way, take giving of something. It's not always a solution that works perfectly, but also to have a president who truly wishes to unify. It's possible that if President Trump wins a second term, maybe he turns the tide and decides that he wants to be known as a unifier. I don't see that in the DNA, and maybe there's a candidate that arises on the Democratic side. I've seen some stories, as you have, of some of the candidates who are out there who are talking more in that kumbaya kind of way, and it doesn't seem to be getting the base too fired up. So I hope that but that is the only way it's going to happen, and that is someone who runs and wins, whose sole desire is to unify our country around solving our nation's problems.
Not a student of mine. It looks okay
Hi,
anyway.
Senator. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Noah Redlick. I'm a sophomore at the college. So you spoke a little earlier about the need to return to a foreign policy based on morality and for being a force of good in the world, and I agree. But I was wondering if you could explain your vote in December of last year. You voted against the bipartisan bill by Bernie Sanders and Mike Lee to end our support of Yemen, as they're contributing to the biggest humanitarian crisis in recent years. You've sided with the president in voting against that bill to end our support. I was hoping you could explain why you did that.
Yeah. So I voted a certain way. It wasn't siding with anyone, siding with me. And the mechanism that we were using, and Mike Lee and our friends, as is Bernie, we had a fair debate on the floor, but it was a left-handed way, in my opinion, of approaching the topic. They were using a mechanism to get there that to me is counter to the way that we need to be dealing with foreign policy. And so I just didn't support the mechanism. I didn't support it. So, we've had a lot of hearings on Yemen. Saudi Arabia is certainly ham-handed in what they're doing. But I didn't think that the approach that was being taken on the Senate floor to end all support in the way that was being laid out was the appropriate way to go forward. And it certainly wasn't influenced by the president or anyone else. It's the same place I had been for some time. But thank you. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator. My name is Francis. I'm also Professor Carter's student. So I know you come from the business background. So you start your business career when you were 13, collecting trash and bagging the ice. And then you sold your company in 1990, become very successful in the business. So I also come from business background. I work in the bank, and many of us coming from private sector. So once you said your business background is very valuable in your political career, so I wonder what's the leadership lesson you learned in the private sector that you applied in the politics?
What was the last sentence?
What leadership lesson did you learn in the private sector that you could use in the public sector?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there are very few people in the Senate that are for real business people, very few. I mean, there are some that have been around it, but have never really signed the front of a paycheck, if you will, and built a business and know what it means to borrow money and have personal liability and all that. Very limited. And so just being in the Senate with that background, like Mark Warner has, like Mitt Romney has today, and I could name others, is a valuable thing just for the diversity. But it teaches you about the challenges that we have just in company creation, in value creation, some of the issues you deal with employees. I mean, that firsthand experience. But I would say from the standpoint of leadership, to run a company, to create a company, to be successful, you have to create a vision and put the pieces in place to make that happen. There has to be a mission that you're about, and you've got to organize around that. That is useful in every arena, whether it's running Harvard, whether it's running the country, whether it's running a state, whether it's running a city. And so I think it's incredibly valuable, and I'll just tell you to also go out in business at a young age, and all of us have to follow our own passions and our heart. We have to follow our heart. I mean, we're going to do well in life if we follow our heart. I was fortunate that my passion was business in the beginning, but I'll say that having the independence to know that, no matter what happens, I know I have the ability to provide for my family, and that is a very useful thing in the public arena also. Okay.
Yes. Professor Carter was asking you about his father not recognizing the Republican Party. This is a political question. You, Senator, were a great star in the party, and Paul Ryan was a star, and Trey Gowdy and others, and many of them left in 2016. Is there a theme to this? How do we understand that as outsiders?
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate you asking. And I wish on the front end I'd followed through, and you've given me the opportunity. I do not want any young person in America to think that I left the United States Senate because I don't think that public service is a value. I think it's absolutely honorable, and that good people need to do it. Otherwise, you leave it to others who maybe aren't so good. For me, I mean, the biggest part of it was just what I had told our citizens back home. Look, I had difficulties leaving. I mean, actually standing up on September the 26th of 2017 and saying I wasn't going to run. I mean, I came to the office 3 times to do that, over about a month's period, to put out the release saying I was leaving, because I knew of the position that I was in, and I knew that my voice mattered here in our country and around the world. As to Paul Ryan, I don't know why he left. Trey Gowdy, I thought Trey Gowdy would leave 4 years earlier. I mean, I think he ought. I always thought he wanted to be a federal judge or do something back home. I don't think he really liked so much being in Congress. I don't think there's a theme there. I will say that about 2015, 2016, I realized that today there's no real desire to deal with the fiscal issues of our country. After the 2008 crisis, I really thought that, we dealt with that in a way that, I felt like we saved our country. It's ended up creating some populist backlash, no doubt. I understand that. But I really thought we'd move to the fiscal issues after that. Washington watchers told me, Corker, there's no way it's going to happen. It's going to take a crisis for that to be dealt with. I kept offering legislation to try to solve that problem. Unfortunately, I'm beginning to worry that it's going to take a crisis to solve that problem, or a president that's willing to run on it. And by the way, that's like running on spinach instead of sugar. And everybody right now wants to run on sugar in this populist environment. But let me that had nothing. There was a little bit of something there. Maybe with Paul, the same thing. I don't know. But for me, it was 90% that I told folks back home I was going to serve 2 terms. Okay, and I hope that young people don't take any. I talked to a congressional candidate this week in another state who asked me the same thing, and I said, please run. No, it had nothing to do. I served 12 years.
Before we go to the gentleman up in the, where did it go? Where did the deficit go? Where did all the it was
we had the
big issue 6 years ago.
We had your friends and mine, Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, funniest man in the world.
He is.
Ash, you remember they had this thing, which by the way, a commission never could even agree to. but it was only going to reduce the debt by $4 trillion. Today, it's not even worth going through the exercise almost. I'm sorry, it would build confidence, but we're in such a different place today. There's just no focus on it. I mean, you look at Social Security. So we just read the other day that it's going to, start eating its own core, meaning you're going to start going down. It's not going to, the proceeds, you're going to be eating into the corpus of it beginning 2020. And it's such an easily solvable problem, so easily solvable. And it's like 4 little levers that you could pull that I maybe not the most liberal person in this room I could sit down with, but maybe somebody who's sort of center liberal. I feel like I could sit down and we could come to an agreement that you would think is not that draconian. And part of it does mean that we've got to pay more taxes. Right now we're collecting taxes on 83% of wages. We need to be collecting on 90%. But really just increase the age by maybe a month or 2 each year through the year 2050. Really? And maybe have a cost of living increase that's not as rapid for people like you and I, but maybe more rapid for lower income citizens. I mean, is that draconian? I remember making a presentation like this and seeing a man out in the audience and his veins were just popping out of his neck. When he heard me say this, I made 66 presentations on the fiscal issue around our state, and he actually looks at, I called on him first. I like controversial town hall meetings. I called on him first, and he said, I cannot believe you would talk about raising the age of Social Security. And he actually had to be 75 years old if he was a day. And I said, sir, no offense, I just don't think this is going to affect you, okay? And people never hear the rest of the story, but we could solve that. That would be a great step, would it not, to solve the Social Security issue, or at least give it 50 or 60 years of life. And then on Medicare, which is far more difficult, there are certain things we can do to at least slow the growth, but there's just no appetite. There is absolutely zero discussion on the topic.
Gentleman in the balcony.
Hi. When you were chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Jay Gleason, and when you were the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you sought to decouple arms sales from human rights. I think you called it compartmentalizing it. And I'm just wondering how we can do, the United States can do good in the world if you're selling arms, compartmentalizing human rights, and those arms are going to countries like the aforementioned Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Nigeria, Israel, and others that have such horrible human rights records.
Yeah, I think I did say that, and I think it was on the sales to Bahrain, on Bahrain, where I had visited, and they no doubt were not treating the Shia population, which is a minority population, in the way that they should, no question. But, as we move people along, stressing human rights, that doesn't mean that when we have conflicts that we automatically cut things off. We continue to work with people, but we do both. And we had some people that had forced a vote on the floor where we would cut our nose off to spite our face with people that we were working with, that we were demarching, that our State Department was pushing heavily on the Shia issue, but just to cut off arms because of things that we knew we were doing was cutting our nose off to spite our face. This is look, I'd love to, as I tell people all the time, I'd love to go into these places and sit down and there be a kumbaya moment, if you will, but we're dealing in tough places. We need to do both, but when I said decouple, when we have this issue, that doesn't mean cutting off all arms sales and cutting off the relationship. It means selling arms, but continuing to push on the human rights piece.
Sure.
Hi, Senator. I'm actually, I've lived in Tennessee most of my life, and great to hear you, great to have you here. One thing I wanted to ask about, jumping back on the topic of, on your background, how that influences, it's influenced your public service. What would you say is, I guess, how can a person in high leadership position in public service, I guess, manage, or what should they do with what they, I guess, like their finances, especially considering how back in 2014, or I guess like there's a 2017 Rolling Stone article that describes how in 2014, when you were on the Senate Banking Committee, you, what was it? You, out of all the senators on the committee, you were responsible for about 93% of all stock trades during that year.
Yeah. So I had a blind pool fund out of Memphis, Tennessee that made investments for me that I could not see. Could not see. When we did an accounting of all of my personal finances, and I appreciate you asking the question, and this fund, we weren't sure if it had 100 participants in it or not. And if you have 100 participants or more, you don't report it. If you have less, then you do. So we just put it all out there. But I had no knowledge whatsoever of those trades. It was in a blind pool done by an organization out of Memphis, Tennessee that manages money for foundations in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is how I knew of them. So that Rolling Stones article was incredibly malicious. It also said that I made all of my money in the Senate. I sold my company for a very large amount of money in 2006 when I was running. And it showed that on the disclosure. And yet this same author reported that somehow my net worth was made while I was in the Senate, as he did numbers of other things. But the fact is that we reported trades. And as it turned out, there were more than 100 investors. And I never even had for them to report what the underlying trades were. But I appreciate you asking.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I was a kid in Memphis, so.
What's that?
But I was a kid in Memphis. Thank you for your service. I actually research congressional transparency, and we just released an article in Foreign Affairs. My name is James D'Angelo. Alexander Hamilton said when they were writing the Constitution that had the deliberations been open, it would have been destroyed by special interests. And all committees in Congress were secret, all important committees, up until 1971. They opened them January 3rd, 1971. And immediately, it was a point of the lowest partisanship in history. And once they open them, the partisanship flares up. People start producing all the gotcha amendments.
Let's get to the question, if you don't mind.
The gotcha amendments
Yeah.
that we see. I was wondering if you could talk about that. What we find is that secrecy actually overwhelmingly prevents lobbyists from destroying the process and prevents sort of the weaponization of the amending process. And how
So
you feel?
what an interesting observation. I'm going to be at MIT tomorrow looking at going through their media lab. And one of the areas I've asked them to show me has to do with citizen involvement and how these major town halls take place. So I've mentioned this in the last two meetings that I've had back in Tennessee. So we are a democratic republic, right? In other words, we elect people to make decisions on our behalf. It's not a straight democracy. And, people ask me all the time, they say, Corker, are you worried about money in politics? And I say, no. I mean, especially as you look at the races this year, the Democratic nominees are raising money online, right? I'm not worried so much about that. It's the social media, just like the gentleman asked me the question a minute ago. I mean, just all this stuff that gets out, that's out there, that's not even true. And yet we've got citizens that are relating directly with senators and House members in a huge way, and it is driving the gotcha amendments. It's driving votes on things that candidly are not in our country's interest, and yet we want our citizens to be informed and we want them to be involved. I would just say to you that your point is well taken, at every meeting I've ever been in that was confidential, the level of discourse and discussion was far more sensible, far more responsible, far more real, not about gotcha. And I think that's why China, as they watch us, I don't know what the answer is, okay, but I think when I mentioned earlier that they think their model is superior, that's the way they solve problems, right? I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating that. I'm saying to you that we do have a problem, and that is that because of the way things are with social media, with everything else, having a real debate, a real discussion about topics as they really are is far more difficult. And let me tell you what we've, and Ash knows this well, what we do in the Senate now, or what senators now do, if they want to have a meeting where it's real, it's substantive, it's not about, you know, getting a cheap shot, it takes place down in the skiff, even if it's not classified. I mean, even if it's something that's been on the front page of the paper for weeks, if we want to have a serious discussion, unfortunately, we have to go down to the skiff where senators actually talk with the presenters like Ash or others and have a discussion that's sober and real. Now, that doesn't mean when people walk out of that meeting and there's a big gaggle of reporters there that they don't make some cheap shots then, possibly. But your point is an interesting point, and I don't know how we preserve sober and serious debate when we're in a tough dilemma right now.
We're running almost out of time. One more question.
Thank you very much. My name is Diana Meyer, and specifically the question is on nuclear issues. To the extent that you, as head of the Foreign Relations Committee, thought that the nuclear agreement should be approved by the Senate, as all treaties have been, and now President Obama has said to President Trump that Korea and the nuclear issue with Korea is the single most important issue. Could you give us your opinion with regard to nuclear issues in the world today?
Yeah, I thought the Iran agreement should have been a treaty, but the reality of it was probably that there's no way a treaty would have been ratified. So I wrote a letter to, I think it was May of the year that the deal was done. I wrote a letter to President Obama on I think it was a Friday, might have been a Thursday, asking how they plan to implement the Iran agreement. Unbelievably, they wrote me back within 48 hours and told me that they were planning to go straight to the United Nations and have a vote of the UN Security Council to put it in place. Congress had put the sanctions in place that mostly brought Iran to the table. No doubt administrations had been involved in that too. And that flew in the face of what I thought was our congressional prerogative. John Kerry helped me a little bit with the issue by coming and testifying one day in the committee. And Tim Kaine from Virginia, a Democrat, asked him the question, wait a minute, and I'd already been, you know, throughout the hearing talking about this. We put the sanctions in place. Shouldn't we have something to do if the sanctions are coming off? And Secretary Kerry said, well, you are going to be able to vote on that in 8 years. It was just a one tick, too cute comment, if you will. I was able to pass out of the committee unanimously a bill to go to the floor that said that Congress would have the ability to vote on this agreement once it was completed, and it would have to sit in place for 90 days for us to be able to look at it. We weren't able to stop it from happening. There was 58 votes in the Senate. You have to have 60. But things like that should, if they can be, done by treaty. President Trump comes in. I could go through a long scenario of discussions there, but obviously he left it just like he did the Paris Accord. So if you want something that's going to stay in place over time, that's going to be more binding, then you've got to do it by treaty. I would hope that whatever we do with North Korea is something that we can do by treaty and that people can count on it. But the president is the one that decides whether something is going to be an executive order, an executive agreement they call it, or whether it's going to be a treaty. And, you know, you see what happens. If it's done by an executive agreement, it can be undone immediately, just with the flick of a pen. It takes no action by Congress. A treaty is something that's very much more long-standing and more permanent. And that's, if we can, those are the way those agreements ought to be. Did I answer it fully?
Unless you wanted to comment more broadly on nuclear issues.
Yeah, so I will. I mean, I played a big role in the START Treaty being ratified. I caught a lot of grief on my side of the aisle for having done so. To me, it was an absolute no-brainer. The fact is that we were going to be able to lower the amount, the size of our nuclear arsenal, and let modernize them so that we actually knew the weaponry we had worked. I don't know if you've seen I know you haven't, Ash has, but some of the guidance systems we had on our nuclear weaponry were almost like black and white TV tubes guiding them, seriously. My BlackBerry at the time was far more sophisticated than the guidance systems we had on our nuclear weapons. And so, to me, to pass the Nuclear START Treaty, where we could get the number of armaments down, but really modernize them to make sure we knew they worked, which saved us money, allowed us to modernize, and to pass an amendment on there relative to our missile defense system was very appropriate, and I supported it. I hope that New START can be improved. It'll be looked at again and extended. So I support that. INF, no doubt, Russia's been in violation for some time. Come to find out, after the New START Treaty was being ratified and discussed during that time, they were actually in violation during that time, I think. We were not aware of that in Congress. But I think if you have parties that are violating constantly, you demarche them, you let them know, and they don't come into compliance, something has to be done. But what I hope it isn't the beginning of is us undoing other nuclear agreements that are working, and I hope we actually have the ability to build on those to make the world a safer place.
We need to let you go, Senator, but let me just say that how grateful we are, both for your long service, but also with the civility with which you conduct yourself and always have. In today's world, that comes as a great breath of fresh air. It is uplifting to all of us. So thank you for your long service to our country, and in a way I certainly believe in, to all of humanity, and also for uplifting us tonight. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thank you.